You guys can say hi.
Hi, I'm Felissa.
Hi, my name's Jonah.
Oh,
You want to say your
I
name?
know Jonas.
And this is Gabriel.
Gabriel.
Jonah, do you have a whale?
Jonah, Gabriel.
Do you have a whale, Jonah?
Pretty.
Like in the
Jonah,
store.
No.
No.
No, yeah, no, we don't. We have we have a lizard.
I love.
Yeah.
We have two lizards.
We have two lizards. Yeah, we have two of most things that are important. We have two lizards. That's right. So I thought I would. We do Havdallah every night, so it's wonderful to have you guys in our home. I mean, we do Havdallah every Saturday night, so it's wonderful having you guys in our home for this. It's one of the. It's a weird way, of course, to meet everyone as it is, but it's really wonderful. You guys get to come into our home, so it's very nice. I want to share, like I did a little bit on Friday night. I want to share. Just quickly teach you a quick nigun, and then we'll move into Havdallah. This nigun I associate mostly with Kol Nidre. Actually, it's a tune that goes to the piyut Ya'aleh, which comes up in Kol Nidre on Erev Yom Kippur. That piyut is about. It's sort of a tour of the day, and it talks about our prayers start to go up on Erev Yom Kippur, and then they build throughout the day, and they reach their climax at Ne'ilah, which is what that piyut describes. And I was thinking about this week in terms of Shabbat. There's this idea, there's this Hasidic idea that the holiness of Shabbat is actually building throughout the day. So it starts on Friday night when it enters, and it just gets more and more intense. You get more and more holiness as the day progresses until it reaches like its apex right now in the moments before when Shabbat goes out. So this nigun is sort of about that, and it goes like this. So try that. So then it repeats. So the first two parts are almost the same. This is the third part. Just try that. And that's it. Oh, hi, 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 oh, hi, 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 oh, hi, 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 and the next and last thing I want to do before we just do Havdalah is one thing that we usually try to do some weeks when we manage to do it after Shabbat is share things about the new week that we're looking forward to. I was going to invite folks to do that. We have a lot of people on, so I think if we could open up the chat box, and if anyone, we'll sing the Nigun a few more times, but if anyone wants to just open up the chat and just share something you're hoping for in the new week, or a highlight from your Shabbat, or something you want your community to know, because we have, over the past year, we've had the ways in which we connect are largely this, and even as you guys are here to, interview me, I also want you guys to have a chance to connect with one another a little bit, and of course, I'm curious about whose faces I'm seeing in the windows as well. So we'll sing the Nigun a few more times, and if you want to put something in the chat that you're looking forward to, I'll at least enjoy reading them, and hopefully everyone else will also. So from the top. I Come on, let's get a few more things we're looking forward to. One more time through. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. There's some profound things in that list, like grandchildren saying names for the first time. That's pretty awesome. And second doses, which is also really awesome.
How many people are there anyway?
There's 51 people signed on, and some of the rooms have more than one person. So it's like it's probably more than that. All right. We're going to do Havdallah. It's on page, if you have a Siddur and it's open, it's on page 299 in your Sim Shalom. And I got to go to the stove because matches are one of the things that we forgot to order in our order this week. So I'm going to go to the stove and we're going to hit the lights and I'll be right back.
It's on door.
Gonna hold it, Jonah?
No way.
No way.
No fire.
No fire for you? Okay. Hinei al Yeshuati avtach v'lo avchad ki ozi v'zimrat yad Adonai v'ayleilu Yeshua u'shavtem ha'musom minei Yeshua la'Adonai Yeshua Adonai Yeshua m'chabir chatach asar Adonai tzvot imanu miskav lenu kovsela ashrei lamotech ba'achanai Yoshia melchen mirim kornu la'yudim hayta or v'simcha v'son b'ikar intia lanu kos Yeshua dasav v'shem Adonai kra. Ay 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 da 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 ay 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 da 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 ay ay da 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 ay ay da 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 ay da 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 ya da 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech haolam borei beri hagafen borei beri hagafen yai dai da 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 dai 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 da 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 dai 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 da 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 dai dai ay ay da da dai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei besamim borei minei besamim da 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 yai dai da 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 dai 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 da 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 dai dai yai dai da 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 dai 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 da 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 dai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei meorei ha'esh borei meorei ha'esh yada da da ay ay yada da da dai 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 da 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 dai dai ay ay yada da da dai 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 da 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 dai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh lechol ben or lechoshech Ben Yisrael le'amim, ben Yom Hashemi, le'sheshet yemei Amaseh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu hamavdil ben kodesh lecho. Shavua tov, 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 Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbim, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Agiladi, Bimhera v'yameinu, Yavo Eleinu, Imashiach ben David, Imashiach ben David. Shavua Tov, everyone. So in a minute, you guys want to say goodnight? You guys will probably be up, still awake when I'm done, but
Good night, Laila Tov.
yeah, well, we'll get to see some of you guys tomorrow again. Shavua Tov, guys. All right, so come into my office. Okay, welcome to my office, which is also my bedroom. We have a very small apartment here in Chicago. So, Darren, do you tell me? Do you want me to just get started?
Absolutely, yes.
Absolutely, yes. Okay, cool. So, let me just forgive the silence for one moment while I just get situated. I'm going to share my screen in a minute. Let's make sure that's all set up. Okay, good. So, okay. So you can see my screen? Yes, you can see the Hudson River. Fantastic. So let's share a little bit about what we're going to do. Oops. I'm going to stop the screen share for a second and just explain a little bit. Then I will reshare it in just one moment. So just a little bit about what we're going to do. We can all see each other's faces while I'm introducing things. So some of you might have seen on my resume or in one of the videos, there's something that Darren sent out that I am working on my PhD at the Jewish Theological Seminary. We're also into rabbinical school. I am studying Kabbalah in general, Jewish mysticism in general, and Hasidism in particular. So I thought for the next, 45 minutes, an hour. I mean, I could go on forever, but I won't keep you here forever. So it'll be about an hour, 45 minutes, an hour. You're not a prisoner here, of course. I thought I'd give a little introduction to Kabbalah. Some of you guys have maybe studied Kabbalah before, or you have studied some of these. Probably none of these particular texts you've seen before because they're not the most famous texts in the world. But I was thinking we'd think a little bit about Jewish mysticism in general and mysticism in general, and then we'll look at a few texts as sort of an entry into that. There's many different ways you could introduce a subject like Jewish mysticism. There's always been a very short introduction, and mainly I want to do it through text, which is something that I always like to do when possible is to dive into a text. So the first thing I want to ask. And you can certainly raise your hand and I will scroll through. I want this to be as interactive as it can be. You can also, if I'm not seeing your hand for some reason, you have something you want to say, just drop it in the chat. My first question for all of you, and I'm going to present a definition a little bit later, but I'm just curious sort of what you guys think. When I say mysticism, or when you think about mysticism, how would you define it? How would you how would you describe a mystical experience or mystical approaches to religious life? And I'll preface this just by saying that mysticism is certainly not an indigenous Jewish word. The Jewish word for mysticism is Kabbalah, and there's a whole small cottage industry among people who go to like Jewish mysticism conferences about whether mysticism is in fact a good or bad translation of Kabbalah. I tend to think it's okay, but people argue about that like they argue about everything. But mysticism itself is not even really, for the most part, an indigenous term that mystics use. In other words, for most of human history, people who come up to you and say, "Hey, I'm a mystic," right? That's usually engenders maybe a little bit of suspicion, and generally is not something that mystics do. For the history of that word, and that word comes out of medieval Christian scholastic discussions of different kinds of religious experience. That word has been used by non-mystics to describe a certain kind or category of religious experience. It's another way of saying it's an academician's term. Right? It's a term that is used when we're thinking about the academic study of some phenomena out there in the world, namely mystical phenomena. Okay, so I'm curious, how would you define it? Mysticism. So someone, I'm sorry, I only said, I think it's David, who's the president, right? Says, Mr. President says, mysticism is a personal interaction with God. Okay, great. That's definitely a big part of it. What else? Other hands, you can either raise your hand virtually or physically, and I will try to unmute you if you can. Or PJC admin, can people unmute themselves?
Yes, they can.
Yes, they can. So I trust you. We've all been unmuting ourselves since at least the beginning of the pandemic. So you're all adults. So let's just, so raise your hand if you got something to say. Again, definitions of mysticism.
I think of it as something that is an experience that can't be explained rationally. That there's not
an experience that can't be explained rationally. Okay, good. Other ideas?
I would add to that, similar to not being able to be explained rationally, I would say materially, right? Through our understanding of the material world, we can't explain it.
Okay, so there's something. Non-corporeal about, or something that transcends our everyday experience. Good. And then Annie, I think you had some.
Yeah, I think it's like, for me anyway, it's beyond the word, and it's beyond the ideas of all religions, because it's the esoteric part of religion. So to me, it has to do with not like a lot of interpretation, but it has to do with like a communication between yourself, the spirit world, God, and the rest of humanity, regardless of their religion, creed, or race. And I feel that all religions have an esoteric.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Annie. I was going to bring up a point about that a little bit later, but that's a good way for me to jump off and say, yes, I share that perception. And there's another thing that scholars of Jewish mysticism, or scholars of mysticism in general, argue about, is whether or not it makes sense even. All right, so I posed a question in the beginning. There's what is mysticism with a capital M? So there's a whole question about whether that's an even sensible question to ask. Why? Well, maybe there's no such thing as mysticism with a capital M, but rather only hyphenated mysticisms. So Jewish mysticism, Christian mysticism, Islamic mysticism. And you're right, Annie, when you say that all world religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, all of them, as far as I know, harbor within them mystical elements, right? Groups of mystical weirdos who basically, as you point out, Annie, in some ways reach after transcending the very religious systems in which they are situated. All right. Now, the question, though, is, well, does it make sense to speak of mysticism with a capital M? Well, so there's two schools of thought about this. The academician's term for these schools of thought are perennialism on the one hand, perennialism being something that, well, it comes around every year, or it is eternal, right? So people who would advance sort of a perennialist view of this would say, yes, there are, as maybe you were suggesting, Annie, there are these kinds of mystical experiences to be had, or these mystical modes of existence, or mystical modes of spirituality, that in fact transcend and reach beyond the constituent parochial faiths or religious systems in which they are situated. Right? So Jewish mysticism reaches beyond itself, Christian mysticism reaches beyond itself to a unified core, right? And then, on the other hand, there are people who call themselves contextualists, right? And as the name suggests, contextualists will argue about the history of mysticism and about the phenomenology of mysticism, but also about the history of any kinds of religious experiences or realities, that they are always already rooted in the context of specific religious cultures. So what the Jewish mystic might experience, the Kabbalist, let's say, is constrained by the forms of by the traditional forms of Jewish life and language that he or she knows, and in which of which he or she considers him or herself a part. So, for instance, Christian mystics are much more likely to experience the stigmata, right, the markings of the cross, than are, let's say, medieval Sufis, for whom that's not the stuff of their religious experience. So there are these two poles of thought. I will put, I suppose, my cards on the table because I don't play things too close to the vest. I'll show you where I stand. I actually, though it is somewhat less fashionable in sort of, to the extent that I'm in an academic field, it's somewhat less fashionable. Annie, I actually share your perception that there is something about one benefit, I think, as contemporary people of engaging with mystical text, and specifically with Kabbalistic text, is that very often, I believe, these texts do point towards a deeper ground of shared human religious reality that can provide an occasion for very deep and very authentic ecumenical encounter. And you see this in a variety of ways. Mystical text, Christian, whether you're looking at medieval Christian mystical text or medieval Jewish mystical text or Islamic mystical text, they very often, the similar images crop up. Images like of water flowing into a stream, right? As Isaac of Akko, an important medieval Kabbalist, said, what is the mystical experience like? It's like I am a pitcher poured into a running stream of water. And you find almost the exact same image in Christian mystics. Or a really good example of this, there's a book by Ibn Arabi, the great 10th century Islamic poet and philosopher and mystic, called The Bezels of Wisdom. I don't know what it's called in Arabic. I do not read Arabic. It's called The Bezels of Wisdom in... does anyone know what a bezel is? I did not know what a bezel was until I encountered this book. I'm just curious. Does anyone, if you know what a bezel is, this is like The Price is Right. It's not like The Price is Right. It's like Jeopardy. Does anyone know what a bezel is?
Isn't it like if you have a ring, isn't it like a diamond, all the little things on your ring? All the little edges, okay. The edges of the diamond. So it's dafka, not the diamond. It is the edges. Thing that holds the jewel. Oh, the thing that holds the jewel. Right, Yashikov. So I didn't know that until I encountered this book. So the image there, what is that image? What is that image saying? It's saying that the jewel is always the same. It's only the setting of the jewel that changes. Right? So you can have so if the jewel is mystical truth, the setting might be
medieval Kabbalah, or medieval Judaism, or medieval Islam, or 21st century Judaism, or 21st, right? So the jewel is the same, but the bezel changes. And the whole point of that book is that very idea, which is that mysticism tends to reach beyond itself. Okay, good. Any other sort of ideas about definitions of mysticism, things that so far you know come up for you that you'd like to share, and then I'll present sort of a definition of my own, and then we'll get into some text. Any other ideas? Yeah, Frederica. Yeah, unmute yourself.
This is Ephraim Siegel.
Oh, hi, Ephraim.
In addition to the very valid comments that that my fellow congregants have made about a kind of explanation or experience of the world or of God that is not material, that is not based in logic, it almost seems to me as if to have a mystical experience, you have to separate yourself from the material world. So you go to the top of a mountain, you go into a desert, you lock yourself in a room with bread and water, or if you're really serious, you skip the bread. In other words, you have to separate yourself from the day to day in order to free yourself to have what I would call a mystical experience.
Yeah, good. Although it's interesting, I think that's a good point. One of the interesting, so you remind me of two things. The first thing is that if you're hardcore, you forego the bread. So one of my favorites. So when I was in college, I was very interested in the history of early Christianity. I had a marvelous professor of early Christianity at Brown, and so I took a lot of classes in that. And there were these some of the ancient Christian mystics. We're talking about the ancient Roman world. You know, they take it upon themselves to only eat the Eucharist. They're going to eat nothing other than the Eucharist. The little wafer and wine, except. Some of their Roman observers, how we know about some of these things, they say, well, they ate the Eucharist, but it was like their Eucharist was like a huge loaf of bread with like nuts in there and fruit, and it's like, well, so that's so yes. But if you're really hardcore, you forego the bread. The notion of separating yourself from the physical, I think you're right. I think we see that in a lot of mystical communities throughout history, sort of either sort of a distancing from the physical, or even an abnegation, a rejection, a harsh rejection of the physical. One of the interesting turns in later Jewish mysticism, Hasidism, we're not going to talk all about sort of what Hasidism is today and what it was, but one of the later turns in Hasidism is this idea of avodah begashmiut, sacred service through the corporeal, in which at least as some of the early Hasidic masters described it, like the Baal Shem Tov, all activities from going to the marketplace to to religious activities to having sex, all of these activities were potentially occasions, or should be seen, rightly understood, were occasions for mystical elevation. But in general, Ephraim, you're right. There's this negative aspect, or this negative perception of Gashmiut, of the physical world. Okay, any other thoughts before I offer sort of a one more thought? I see Sheldon's iPad, though I'm not sure if you're Sheldon or not, but go ahead. You got to unmute.
In the Jewish tradition, relevant to what Ephraim said, the first indication we have of mysticism is with the Essenes, 1st century Dead Sea Scrolls. That's our earliest understanding of mysticism. It goes way back, and this was a community, the Essenes, who totally separated themselves from the rest of whatever the resident community in what was then Palestina was, and produced the mystical documents that we now have of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the war between the children of light, the children of darkness, etc. So we go way back. And the other thing is, the world's 3 great religions came out of that area that we call Israel, Christianity. It's a desert. It's a desert, and that is a separation, a physical separation in itself. But I think for Jews, there was a conscious separation going back to the Essenes and then continuing through the generations until finally we had the Spanish school.
So it's a lot of very interesting points there. And on the notion that the Essenes, so this sect that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, whether they are the first mystics or not, and that's a whole interesting, or the first sort of record of Jewish mystics that we have or not. That's a whole interesting question too. I mean, you could look, and there's argument about this. Like you could look back at Ezekiel's strange visions of the chariot and the eyeball, the spinning eyeballs. Well, is that a mystical experience? Or, and by the way, Abraham Joshua Heschel he is vociferous on his answer is no, that Sinai was not a mystical experience. And this is part of Heschel he has a bone to pick with mysticism because he basically is concerned that mystics aren't sufficiently socially engaged, which is another thing you alluded to. There, it's interesting. One, and this is the last thing I'll say about physicality, and we'll move on to some text in a second. Though there is this impulse towards the rejection of the physical, pretty much in all religious systems, and certainly in the mystical strains of them. Jewish mystics, as much as some of them might have wanted to be, monks and, go in a room with only bread and water and whatever. That has not actually historically been the case in almost all circumstances. Even folks like, you alluded to the Spanish school, folks like Chaim Vital and the Tzfat mystics of the 16th century, who were, described harsh ascetic regimens and were pretty intense and right about their mystical practice. All of them we know were married and had children and like had jobs. And this has been true throughout. There's something about, like all mystics, as Annie pointed out, right, long to transcend the the shackles of whatever religious system they're housed in. But they rarely do it entirely, and they rarely do it completely. And one way in which Judaism simply doesn't let you go, for the most part, is the extraordinary value, traditional value placed on things like work and family. So being like and there have been Jews throughout history who have led monkish lives and have decided, kids and family are not for me. But by and large, the tradition overwhelmingly militates in a direction of, yeah, but you should really have a job. You really should work. Like, you really shouldn't just sit and drink bread and water all day. All right. So thank you for all that. We'll have more chance to talk as we go. So I'm going to share my screen again. So this was, I'm going to get to full screen in a second. So I call this Dynamic Divinity, or Why is God Great? And it's a very brief intro to Kabbalah. And we're going to we're going to get into some text that illuminates for me what is one important idea of the early Spanish Kabbalists, that it's, there's not going to be an exhaustive intro to Jewish mysticism. We're not going to get into the Sfirot, and we're not going to get into all kinds of things. This is just a taste of, the garden of mystical delights. And if you guys think, wow, I got to have more of that, just hire Rabbi Ben Reznick and you'll get some more. So this is just a little appetizer. And you'll see their Hudson. This will hopefully make sense as we get towards the end why I have two pictures. Those are both the Hudson at very different parts of the Hudson's life as a river. So characteristics of mysticism, and I'll put these in for us, and then I'll share the screen. So some of these we've talked about. The first thing that, and these I'll say these are not these are not, there's not the final word on what mysticism means, but the definition that I'm going to present is more or less the one that was presented to me when I was first starting the serious academic study of Jewish mysticism, and I suspect that many people in the field, at least in the academic field of studying mysticism, would accept something like these as at least helpful in terms of, orienting ourselves to what we're talking about. And of course, whenever you get definitions like this, you can point, everyone can point to a counterexample, right? That's going to happen. So the first characteristic is, there's two really that I often think about. The first is this one, which is a desire for direct or unmediated experience of divine reality. And someone, I think, dropped this in the text box, or something very similar. David, I think, dropped it in the text box. Right. So one thing that mystics tend to be the goal of mystical inquiry and mystical activity is, you want a direct experience of God or of divine reality, whatever that looks like. Right? You don't want it mediated. You don't want it through a text. Or you want to experience it, right then. And the second, and this is related in some ways, but I think this distinct. The second is, and I think this is true in almost all mysticisms, and it's in the word as well, at least the English word, which comes from the Greek mysterium or mystery, which refers to something concealed, like the ancient Greek mystery religions. That's where the term comes to us through the medieval Christian scholastics. A belief that the world as experienced does not comprise the deepest nature of reality, right? We have an everyday world, right, that we experience, right? But that is not, in fact, according to most mystics, the truest layer of divine reality. And by following certain practices or certain paths, the mystic can then apprehend what truly is the deepest nature of divine reality. And here I'm going to add, so I put 2 because, well, my teacher gave me 2, and I think 2 is pretty good. For me, though, there's actually a 0.5 here, and this gets to there's like a 2.5, like a little piece of number 2 that I feel like is important, that gets at something that sort of Annie got at, and I was talking about this idea of mysticism reaching beyond itself. Usually, not always, but usually, when mystics do in fact reach beyond themselves, what they find is a world in which all things collapse into one. So usually, some of the content of mystical revelation, at least as described by the mystics, is that it seems, like there's me and you and, my cat. I don't have a cat. I used to. Right? It seems like there are all of these different, and a table, right? It seems like there are all of these different things and that experience is differentiated. But in fact, no, they're not. That's fundamentally an illusion, and that at base, all things are one, are part of the same organic whole, which usually means we're all just part of God. God is coterminous with the sum total of all that is. That those are the same things. So before we get into text, any thoughts, any burning questions that you're just gonna not be able to sleep tonight if you don't ask them right now?
A quick question, which is, what do they find missing? An assumption of this is they're finding something missing in the everyday world, in the reality they're living in. So is that a consistent theme, or what's what's missing from their daily lives that they want to exceed them or go beyond them, or that what's the critique of the material world, the rational world?
I mean, I guess I could answer that, flippantly and say, well, what's missing from your daily? I mean, what's missing from my daily life? I can think of a few things that I wish were a little better. I mean, my hip was hurting because I banged it sledding the other day. I mean, so that's one answer is, well, what I think you would answer that question, of anyone who sort of seeks a religious path. I mean, it's not always that. I take that. I mean, it's not always that religion starts at a place of a sort of dissatisfaction with the world as is, but sometimes it is. I mean, I think. I'll go at this from this angle. So I think that one thing that became clear, I mentioned a little bit earlier that I studied ancient Christianity a lot when I was in college, and one of the literatures of the early church are these hagiographies, these like saints' lives. And one of the things that a lot of the saints do is fast a lot. And fasting, by the way, is a very prominent piece of Jewish mysticism as well. And I think for one of the reasons why at least when I was studying the early church fathers, one of the things that became clear to me was that fasting was in many ways a response to hunger. And in the ancient world, and look, for some people in the modern world, hunger is a real and abiding part of existence. And so in the ancient world, it was like, I remember, like in America in March, for a few weeks, it was like hard to get flour, right? Because everyone was buying flour, and it was like, oh, I got to eat chickpeas instead. I mean, it was like, this is not. But right, but it was right. I mean, it was a stressful time. But in the ancient world, it's like, everyone, even the richest landowner in Rome, was a couple of bad years away from starving. It's like one bad year of crops. It's like maybe you have something in your storehouse. 3 bad years of crops, and it's like you were starving. And one of the, I think part of the impulse, let's say, towards fasting or maybe towards mystical experiences, you're going to take ownership of the fact that you're hungry, right? If suddenly your hunger is a ritual act, then it's a way of imposing a certain kind of an amount of control, let's say, on a sort of somewhat unforgiving reality. I don't know if that totally answers your question. I suspect the real answer to your question is it's different for lots of different mystics. I mean, and lots of different religious people. We're all here tonight, I'm sure, for somewhat different reasons, and I hope most of you aren't here tonight because you're horribly dissatisfied with reality as is. But if there's a piece of you that's here tonight that says, well, I would love for reality to be a little bit different, well, I hope this provides some of that, or at least provides some food for thought. Annie,
I wanted,
yeah, go quick.
I also found that shul can be very limiting, and what happens is I find that mysticism in various religions kind of come together, and there's not a lot of separations between the religions at that point. And I think when you're in temple and a lot of stuff around you is going on that's not pertaining to Jewish people, and that the congregation and the rabbi speaks more to the Jewish part of things and isn't more inclusive, which I think our shul is very inclusive. I think some people just want to reach to the higher realms of mysticism so that they can feel kind of a more universality of their religion and their beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think particularly in the contemporary world, and look, there are profound things, I believe, as well about, cultural particularity, right? Even as I put my cards on the table. So I am not a mystic. I don't think of myself, I don't, I've never had mystical experience. Hopefully I'd be open to one, but I don't, hear, I don't hear the things that mystics describe. But like you, one of the reasons why I really do love mystical ways of thinking is that they do open out onto these deeper realities in which there is not so much division, in which we can have sort of a really genuine meeting across cultures and across faiths and across languages, and so on. At the same time, even as I believe, I also don't personally, long for a day when everyone worships the same. I think it's a beautiful thing that Jews, we do our thing, and I had a very close friend in college who was Hindu, and I loved going, with her to do some Hindu davening when she. I wouldn't participate, but the fact that exists in the world is not just a curiosity for me. It's actually a live and breathing part of my, religious experience. I like the fact that there are, differences that way, and I think preserving them is a good thing as well, even as it's also a good thing to reach beyond them. So, all right, let's look at a little bit of text. And okay, so the first text we're actually going to look at is from Rambam, from Maimonides, who is decidedly not a mystic. So, a little bit of background. So one aspect of mystical traditions that we haven't touched on too much, or I haven't touched on, I don't think, too much tonight, and this is true across the board. I think there are no exceptions to this. If you can find this, well, every time there are not so many exceptions to this, okay? Which is that mystical cultures, so let's say Kabbalists, there is a thoroughgoing anxiety about the public communication and transmission and the writing down of mystical ideas. Why? Because mystical ideas, perhaps because they are inherently antinomian, in the sense that they reach beyond, they destabilize the traditional forms of religious culture that exist, right? That's a danger to the power structure and to society in general. If you think about a religious society, mysticism is inherently, I think, in some ways destabilizing, because it says precisely that the world you experience is not the deepest layer of reality. So if davening 3 times a day is not the deepest, or if keeping kosher is not the deepest layer of what divine reality is about, if it's not, well, it's really only a hop, skip, and a jump to, well, I don't need to do those things, right? And throughout history, that has been a danger of mystical practice. So, given that, Kabbalists are extremely reticent for much of Jewish history to write down, to commit to writing mystical ideas. And yet, there is a vast mystical literature. Now, why is that? Right? If you're afraid that people are going to get the wrong idea, and you're afraid that some sort of heretic rabbi like this one, this is exactly the situation that Kabbalists were worried about. Some, not from enough rabbi would be teaching it to all of these people, and then they're going to get the wrong idea, and then it's going to be a disaster. Right? It's happening. It's happening right now. Right? If that's the concern, well, why write it down in the first place? So one idea, I owe this idea mostly to Moshe Idel, who is a giant in the field of, this is most important, among the 2 or 3 most important living scholars of Jewish mysticism. Moshe Idel and others, he's an Israeli scholar, have argued that basically the medieval Kabbalists, and we're going to look at some text from the Zohar, which is sort of the first and most important, not exactly the first, but the most important crowning achievement of mystical Jewish thought, which sort of sets Kabbalah on the path that it's going to go. He argues that the medieval Kabbalists finally committed their ideas into writing in response to a Maimonidean idea that they found just so obnoxious that they could not allow to go unchallenged. Okay, so this is what Rambam writes in his Hilchot Yesodei Torah and the Mishnah Torah, his sort of monumental tone, Jewish, monumental code, right? All the translations tonight, by the way, most of them, unless they're noted, are my translations. So, ordinarily, I would ask, I'll ask someone. Would anyone like to read for us? You can read in Hebrew and English. Again, if you're going to read in Hebrew, I just ask that you translate as you go. Or you can read my translation. If there are people who want to argue with me about my translation, I would be delighted to have that argument with you. Someone want to read?
I can read the Hebrew.
Okay, bבקשה.
אם יעלה על הדעת שהוא אינו מצוי, אין דבר אחר יכול להימצאות. If one should imagine that he should not exist, nothing else could arise to exist, could be found. יכול להימצאות also, could be, ואם יעלה על הדעת שאין כל הנמצאים מלבדו מצויים, הוא לבדו יהיה מצוי. If one should imagine that all the created things apart from him are non-existent, then he alone would exist. ולא יבטל הוא לביטולים. He would not be nullified for the sake of their nullifications. שכל הנמצאים צריכים לו, והוא ברוך, הוא אינו צריך להם, ולא לאחד מהם. For all created things need him, and he, blessed be he, does not need a single one of them. Heschel would argue with that.
Yes, and as well, yes.
לפיכך, אין אמיתתו כאמיתת אחד מהם. Therefore, his truth is not like their truth.
Good. Toda rabba, Anna. So great. So, so you said Heschel would argue with that. So are the Kabbalists. So this is Maimonides. So Maimonides is vociferous on this point. Okay, I just want to give Maimonides. Maimonides, by the way, you could see his birthdays there. The giant physician and the giant of Jewish medieval philosophy. He was a physician. He was the court doctor to Saladin, who was the Sultan. He spent most of his career in Egypt, and he wrote philosophical treatises and also halakha, and is sort of a once in a millennia intellect. And he, people say from Moshe to Moshe. From Moshe Rabbeinu to Moshe Maimon to Moshe ben Maimon, there was no one like Moshe, right? So Moshe, that's who the Rambam is. And he's vociferous on this point, and this comes out of various other things in medieval philosophical thought, that God's greatness, and I open this by saying, why is God great? Where's my first slide? Slide 2. There we go. Why is God great? The thing that's going to allow Kabbalistic writing and Kabbalistic ideas to crystallize and going to force these Kabbalists to bring some of their ideas out into the open is a conflict with the Rambam, I would argue, and Moshe Yidel would argue, about what makes God great. And let me pause here and ask y'all, what makes God great? What makes God great? If anyone wants to answer, you're welcome to, or drop it in the chat. And if not, just think about it. It is a good thing to think about. What makes God great? Oh, by the way, there's a thing in the chat that I haven't seen. What is the difference? Oh, there's some things in the chat I hadn't seen. All that brings you awe and wonder. What makes God great? Okay. The psychoanalytic. Oh, we're talking about fasting. The psychoanalytic definition of masochism: taking mastery of abuse, deprivation. Okay, so if it's masochism, okay, that's interesting. Sounds like the experience of LSD. That makes sense because Timothy Leary was very involved in world mysticisms. I'm with Maimonides. Anything positive we would say would be an equivocation. Oh, so the notion that all we could say are negative things, right? God is not. You don't say God is one, but you say God is not multiple because God is fundamentally beyond speech. It's a good question. Why is I will have the chat open now, so I'll make sure to see that. It's a good question. Why is God great? For Maimonides, I think, at least in this text, and I think this is true for Maimonides in general, God's greatness lies in God's perfection and God's eternity. God's perfection and God's eternity. God has always been there. God always will be there. And God is perfect in God's self. And Maimonides is really, really extreme about this point. God needs us for nothing. Right? So the mitzvot are for us. Right? The mitzvot, the Rambam's account of the mitzvot, like the sacrifices, but really any of the mitzvot, is that they're for the purification of the human being. And he goes to great length to explain why every single one of them is like that, right? There can't be, there's this traditional division between chukim and mishpatim, right? The rational mitzvot, the irrational mitzvot, like, shatnez, you can't mix linen and wool, and the rational ones, like thou shalt not steal, right? For Maimonides, there can't actually be any irrational ones because it's only that if they seem irrational, we don't know them, but they're still for us, right? There's nothing that God needs from the human being. That's completely anathema to Maimonides. And Anna, you mentioned that Heschel would argue with that, right? Heschel advances a very different conception of divinity in which God actually stands in profound need of man. And I said Heschel has a bone to pick with the mystics, and he does, because he basically doesn't want you to be, lock yourself in a cave and not engage with the world. That also is anathema for Heschel. But Heschel comes out of a mystical tradition. He comes out of the tradition of European Hasidism. And his conception of a profoundly needy God is, I think, the very thing about the Rambam that the medieval Kabbalists can't stand. It really sticks in their craw. And so they have to break their silence. And we are the beneficiaries of the literature that broken silence produces. So for the Kabbalists, and we're going to see this in a few texts, and that's how we'll sort of close out. For the Kabbalists, unlike Maimonides, God's greatness lies primarily in God's dynamism and God's creativity. And the dynamic and creative divine force that the Kabbalists know, and it's important to say, it's not just that the Kabbalists know. We're pretty sure that it's not just a question of sort of mystical ideas and ideation. These were the products of the ancient and the medieval mystical writings were, in fact, the products, we think, of genuine mystical experience. The God that they know stands in profound, dire need of human involvement. Is not self-sufficient in any way, shape, or form. In fact, our doing the mitzvot or not can wreak cataclysmic havoc in the divine realm, or on the other hand, sort of bring the divine realm into higher harmony, and so on and so forth. And this is a core part of Jewish mystical religion, or Kabbalah. So I'll look at the first text. This is from the Zohar. So the Zohar, let's say one or two words about what it is. The Zohar is the crown jewel of medieval mystical creativity. It was composed in the 13th century in Spain by Moshe de Leon, and friends over a couple of generations. So, by the way, the Zohar, as some of you may or may not know, is a pseudepigraphic text, which means it purports to be an ancient text from the time of the Mishnah, written by Shimon Bar Yochai, who is an ancient Mishnaic sage. And for much of Jewish history, that pseudepigraphy has actually been accepted. It has also been argued with throughout all of Jewish history. So it's not that the Jewish, it's not that all Jews throughout all time, Moshe de Leon said, hey, look, I found this text that's been in my attic for 1,000 years. It's not that everyone believed him throughout all history, but that did become the accepted dominant view. I am sorry to burst your bubble. If that was in fact a bubble that you had, but the Zohar was written in medieval Spain, which we know because there are like a few Spanish words in there from time to time, which probably wouldn't have happened if it was written at the time of the Mishnah. Anyways, the Zohar is written in sort of an Aramaic kind of, it's sort of a fake language that they made up, probably based on ancient Aramaic. Of course, they weren't speaking Aramaic, they were speaking Judeo-Arabic, or they were speaking Spanish, or Hebrew in some cases, but they're certainly not speaking Aramaic, the medieval Kabbalists. But they wrote it in Aramaic, probably to make it more concealed, probably to make it more mysterious. And this is sort of one of my favorite passages anywhere in the Zohar, and it says a lot in a short space about sort of how they understand divinity. So, V'nahar yotzei me'eden lahashkot et hagan. The river flowed from Eden to water the garden, which is a quote from Bereshit. This is the verse that the Kabbalists, at least in the Zohar, cite more than any other, I believe. V'hahu nahar denagid v'nafik ikre alma de'ate. And that river flowing forth is called the world that is coming. Alma de'ate, or Olam Haba. Olam Haba, usually translated as the world to come. It's clear in this passage, and at least whenever you're reading Jewish Kabbalistic literature, I believe, the phrase Olam Haba, or in this case Alma de'ate, should be translated as the world that is coming. Because it's always coming. Every morning when the sun rises, the world is recreated anew, right? De'ate tadir. The world that is coming comes always. Velo pasik, and never stops. V'hai hu iduna de tzadikaya. This is the delight of the righteous. L'zaka'a l'hai alma de'ate. By the way, tzadikaya here means the righteous. It probably means the Kabbalist. In other words, what you're supposed to be doing if you're engaging in mystical life is experiencing the world that comes, right? The constant riptide. Right? So I don't know if anyone's ever been whitewater rafting. It's quite something. Yeah, it's quite something to be pulled along by that river. And that's how the Kabbalists understand what it is to experience divinity. De'ashke tadir laginta. That is always watering the garden. Right? In other words, that our renewal is always being fed by this spring, velo pasik, and never stops. So already I think it's somewhat. Any responses to this text or thoughts about this text before we look at another short section from the Zohar? Drop it in there. Some drop in the text. So it is not a future world like the end of time. So the phrase. I'm not Marjut. Is that the right way to pronounce that name?
Maryut.
Maryut. It's a great question. The phrase Olam Haba has a variety of different connotations in Jewish literature. Sometimes, I won't say that it never, certainly sometimes in Jewish literature, it refers to like a future end time. It may sometimes refer to like what we think of in sort of Christian image of heaven, less frequently that. It may sometimes refer to that, but that's less frequent. But definitely in the Kabbalists, it's certainly in this text, and I think in a lot of Kabbalistic texts, it does not refer dafka to a future world. It refers to the notion that renewal is always happening, or like Jack, I think, beautifully said this morning about how the doors of revelation are open to us, and we're going to co-create with God. I think that was his language, and there's going to be a text that we're going to look at a little bit that talks about co-creation with God in just about the most radical way I think it appears anywhere in Jewish text in just a minute. So yeah, but it can mean that they can mean that too as well, Maryut. David, they seem to feel there is not before or after, but a constant flow of the world. Not before or after. You mean like there's no time or something like that? Or that it's like a timeless...
Yeah, it's just sort of like, many, at least in Hinduism, you notice there's this constant cycle. They're not talking about a cycle, but they're just constantly.
Right, they're not talking
like,
about...
it just continues to flow along. It doesn't.
Yeah,
doesn't have an end. It doesn't seem to have a beginning.
Yeah. Kant doesn't have an end. It doesn't have a beginning. Yeah, it's interesting. The notion of not having a beginning was actually, at least in the medieval swimming pool where all of these guys were swimming, is a very radical idea. Maimonides, because this is a big point. This is a big place where Maimonides broke with Aristotle. Aristotle thought that the world was eternal, and Maimonides, based on or at least a lot of Jewish thinkers, except for some Kabbalists, based on the account in Breshit, thinks the world actually does have a beginning. At least it may not have an end, but it definitely has a beginning. But some Kabbalists say no. They say no. Actually, in some ways, Ein Sof, the deepest realm of divinity, is in fact eternal. Well, this text doesn't talk about it. The other thing that makes me think about it, the idea of Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, right? Renew our days as of old. I mean, it's a striking phrase. What exactly does that mean? Renew our days and make them old again, right? That's a very prominent kind of thing that Jews long for. At least according to the liturgy, that's what we long for. Any other thoughts about this text before we look at one or two more?
One thing, the Kabbalistic notion of time is that time is an illusion. We live in the bottom of I know you're not touching Sfirot today, but we live in the world of reality, and,
right.
And we perceive time, but it's an arbitrary perception that we have. But the mystics, the Kabbalists, they define time as an illusion. Other levels of existence, time is immaterial. It's not. And that's what I see expressed here. It's constant.
Yeah. No, I think I'm definitely not going to argue with you sort of on the deepest level. I think they would say yes. And on the deepest level, it's all an illusion, and time is, we're living in eternity, and I think that that's true. Even though, and I'm not going to get into the whole notions of sort of Lurianic Kabbalah and all the different kind of mythical elements, but the notion that some of you guys may be familiar with, the shattered vessels, right? That in the act of creation, God pours this light into these vessels, and the vessels shatter, and then our job is to pick up all the pieces basically and put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I think that implies, on some level, that implies that even divinity itself, at least from our perspective, even divinity itself is participating in some kind of historical unfolding. Otherwise, I'm not sure I know how to understand that image. But I think you're right. I mean, I think that on a deepest level, I think that that's certainly true. And I think that this text reflects, if not total timelessness, just the notion that the world is being recreated every day. I mean, every day is Maaseh Breshit, which is a pretty wild thing that's pretty wild if you think about it. Like the Baal Shem Tov in a different way says, every founder of Hasidic Judaism, every day you're a new person. I mean, I don't know if I want to be a new person every day. I mean, maybe it's once a week or once a year, but every day it's a lot to deal with. Thought I knew who I was yesterday. No, I'm still figuring it out. Okay, let's look at a few more texts. I don't want to keep you here all night, but I do want to look at a few more texts. This is another text from the Zohar. Oops. This is another text from the Zohar. Make sure I get the right text. Okay. All right, so this is another text from the Zohar. That last translation was Danny Math's translation. Danny Math, some of you may have read, he wrote a wonderful volume called The Essential Kabbalah. Moshe Idel was one of the most important, he's one of the other 2 or 3 most important scholars of Kabbalah, and also a wonderful teacher. If you ever have an opportunity to learn with Danny Math, please take advantage of it. He's an extraordinary teacher and sort of spiritual person and kind man, and a genius when it comes to translating. He translated the Zohar, which is a magnificent work of scholarship. This is my translation, so maybe less magnificent, but I still stand by it. This is a sugya, conversation in the Zohar, and it's going to get at a few different mystical ideas. And so the Zohar was written in this kind of fanciful Aramaic. It's often presented along with a Hebrew translation below it. So would someone like to take us through this text? I'll ask to read it either. I don't know that we need to read I won't ask anyone to read the fanciful Aramaic. You can read it either in English or in Hebrew. Does anyone want to read this text? And I might pause you in between just to explain exactly what's going on. Any volunteers? Oops. Volunteers? No. All right, I can take us through it. I'll just read it. I will read it in English here to save some time. And also, I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. So, one who stimulates arousal below. Man avida da'it aruta. This is an important term, hit orarut, in Jewish mysticism. Hit orarut, usually translated as arousal, sort of spiritual arousal or getting fired up. It is certainly as if he brought the holy name to completion. Just as he does below, so too he gives rise to arousal above. So what's going on here? So there's a basic idea, and this is certainly true in Kabbalah and true, I think, as well in most world mystical traditions. There's this idea of as above, so below. As below, so above, right? The idea that the divine realm mirrors and reflects what's actually going on in the human realm, or that the human beings are actually instantiations of divine reality, right? According to the mystics, or at least according to the Lurianic mystics, right? Where did all of those sparks go when they shattered? Well, they went down into us. I mean, the reason why we are alive is because we are all literally incarnate divine beings. Right? We are all literally carrying around a little piece of a broken God or a broken divinity. Right? That's why we're here. Right? We're all, the medieval Christian mystic Meister Eckhart said, "The divine son is born in me every day." Right? It's not just once that a divine being is born into the world. No, according to the Kabbalists, that is happening all the time. And that's why we're here, right? So as below, so above. Thus it is written, "Blessed are those who preserve justice, who create righteousness." So the pasuk is Ashrei Shomrei Mishpat Osei Tzedakah Bekol Eit. Happy is the one who acts justly and is Osei tzedakah, creating tzedakah, or usually it would be translated as doing tzedakah. Here it's creating tzedakah. Why? Osei tzedakah, the Zohar says, creating tzedakah. Zeh hakadosh baruch hu. This is the Holy One, blessed be He. Kivyachol hu osei oto, i.e., He creates him. So who is the He and who is the him? What do you think? Who is the He and who is the him?
Well, clearly the him is capitalized, so the him is God.
Right. So I gave you a little clue there. Right. That's true. With the capitalism, it makes it obvious. That's true. In the Hebrew, it's maybe something like less obvious. Right. The him is God. And so who's the He? Just to bring it on home.
Us.
Yeah. Human beings. Right. Osei tzedakah, according to this reading of the Zohar, and remember all rabbis are pleased to read verses out of context if it suits the thing that they're saying. We, according to this teaching, create God, right? Which I should see, I should see jaws dropping, right? Everyone should be hanging with them. What do you mean? Right. The whole notion of, the whole drama of the world is that we are created in God's image. This says, no. God is created in ours. Okay? Think about it in the context of the Maimonidean idea, right? That God is perfect, and God, God. If we didn't exist, God would exist. But if God didn't exist, we wouldn't exist. It's exactly the opposite. It's if we wouldn't exist, God wouldn't exist. That's what the Zohar is saying here, and it goes on. Okay, so the sugya goes on. Come see. Let us teach about the situation of the mendicant, the ani, right? Someone who's poor. A mendicant has nothing other than that which is given to him, just as the moon has no light other than that which she receives from the sun. I just want to make a note about my translation and gender. My convention when I translate things is to preserve the gendered translation of the text. Other people have different approaches to that. Certainly, the gendered assumptions of the text do not necessarily reflect, or don't in most cases, or in many cases, reflect contemporary sensibilities. I think it is better to translate a text as it is written so we can hear the voice of the text. And then, if we feel free to disagree with the voice of the text, rather than, make everything, say, a gender-neutral kind of translation. That's just my convention as a translator, but I just always like to put that out there. So the moon has no light other than that which comes from the sun, just as the mendicant, the beggar, has nothing other than that which the person who extends their hand. Now, who do we think is going to be based on who's going to be the beggar? Probably. Well, come and see. Tachaze. Why is a mendicant like one who is dead? He exists in the realm of death, for the realm of death gave rise to him. One who takes pity on him and gives him tzedakah causes the tree of life to rest upon him. As it says, tzedakah saves from death. According to that which a person does below, thus he also, literally, okay, and before, I just want to highlight this because it's even more radical. Before, on the first page, it had this little qualifier, which was kivyachol. Kivyachol hu oseh oto, as it were, which is like a softening. They realize they're saying something radical, that human beings create God, and they're going to soften it and say, no, it's sort of like that. What does it say here? What does it say on the next page? It says, I gotta move the chat box so I can see. Right, it says, "Hachinami avid le'ela mamash." Just as one does below, so too one does above. Mamash, or as I like to translate it, mamash, as in really, as in literally. That is what is actually going on in the universe, says the Kabbalah. Happy is the portion who merits creating the holy name above. This is why tzedakah is greater than all else. Why is tzedakah greater from all else? It's because it saves the beggar from death. So the beggar in our realm is the beggar, right? The beggar in the context of the Zoharic sugya here is God, right? God is in the place of the mendicant. And without the activity or even the gifts of the human being, God is like one who is dead. God is like one who is dead, without our passionate involvement. And any thoughts about that? So let's look at the chat. Mariut says, so does this mean a world with Jews who do justice causes godliness in the universe? Conversely, without righteousness, there is no God in the world. Yes, I think that's a very nice sort of socially conscious way of thinking about this. I mean, the Kabbalists, and it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that the Kabbalists talk about this whole process of the human being creating, or maybe perhaps co-creating with the divine. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Zohar talks about it in the context of like social justice, right? In the context of creating a just society, or of rectifying, right, an injustice, or alleviating pain in our fellow people, right? I don't think that's a coincidence, right? The idea that God is animated into the world, let's say, God is likened to the beggar, right? So it's not it's a very short stone's throw to, the thing that animates God into reality is in fact the human extension of the hand, right, to the poor. I think that's very beautiful, right? Because they're saying as below, so above, right? As we do below, so we do above, right? I think that's a very, very good point. Any other thoughts about this? So we've been at it for about an hour, I think, or at least an hour. It's been a little over an hour since we signed on for Havdallah. The teaching has been, I think, about an hour. Darren, or it doesn't have to be Darren, you tell me. I've got one more text which I could show you. Or if we're feeling like, you know what, we're getting tired. It's already it's almost 9 o'clock for you guys. We can call it a night. What do you guys think? I'm good. Trust me, I'm good either way. I mean, I could teach all night. No one's gonna vote. No one's gonna break the ice here.
I think it's enough text.
Think it's enough text?
I do. I mean, I think it's been very rich, but I have a question or two about it. So
all right. So then
more text. So
my first question
is, on the one hand, the notion of mysticism that you presented to us is that what we see in the reality of our material world is not the real world, that the real world is, of course, what is hidden. On the other hand, what you've just presented to us tells us that to actually live like a mystic means to do justice in this world, that we are serving God in a mystical fashion if we actually act like a lawyer or a social worker. And it feels very unmystical in an odd way.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I think that, I wanted to, I'll say a couple things. Number one, I wanted to sort of present, if we're going to do an introduction to mysticism, you can't do an introduction to the whole thing. I was hoping to present sort of, a general kind of catch-all definition, just to, get the gears turning a little bit, which I think is by and large true. But I think you're right. And I think that, I mentioned that a little bit earlier, this notion that there haven't been throughout Jewish history that many Jewish mystical monks. I mean, there were many Sufi monks, and there have been many Christian mystical monks, but in general, the rabbinic Jewish path, as opposed to like the path of the Essenes, who were another ancient Jewish sect, the rabbinic Jewish path is very thickly engaged in the world, in part because there's so much ritual to do. I mean, one of the when I was at my synagogue in Massachusetts, I worked very closely with a lot of Christian ministers in town because there were no other Jewish clergy around, and one of the things that I was and am always struck by about sort of deeply religious, at least Protestant people that I know, is that there's not that much that they do. I mean, I'm not saying they don't have rich religious lives. They do. I mean, they really, really do. And they're deeply religious people and deeply spiritual and so forth. But it's like I think about all the different things I do. I mean, I wear a funny hat. I mean, I light candles at certain times. I don't do things at certain times. I eat kind of different kinds of things. There's all these different kinds of things I do. And so I think that in many ways, the Kabbalistic tradition is somewhat unique in the history, in sort of the pantheon of world mystical traditions, in the sense that it can't totally escape from the day-to-day life. Though I also think, and here's where I think my own values and perhaps sensibilities, and perhaps the values and sensibilities of many other people on the call depart in a significant way from the Kabbalists. I don't know if you see that in this text particularly, but you'll have to take my word for it that it's pretty clear in other texts, including in the Talmud, which is not, a mystical text entirely, though there are mystical sections of the Talmud. I think according to this sugya, the reason why you give to the poor, the real deeper reason, is because of the things that happen up in divine reality. In other words, it's not that it's a fundamental good to alleviate the suffering of this poor person. I mean, they may also believe that, but the real reason why you're doing it is because it does something up there, which is a little bit different awareness, I think, from, let's say, being a lawyer or being a social worker or being thickly engaged in society as we think about it, or at least as I think about it. Any other questions?
I would add one thing. Again, if you're going back to the definition of the Kabbalist, and you touched that before, we are, Kabbalists would say, we are not bags of meat separated from each other. We are all one. The nature, everything that's around us, we are one. And coming from the concept that we are one, and you can call it God or not, but we are all part of this one, and God is that. We are part of God. And we act like different parts on the same body. If we do not cooperate, we have a cancer, So the giving to the poor is symbolic here of, interacting and helping each other, because we have no other way to survive. A
right.
body that its parts are not cooperating with each other will die. So I think for me that's the main message of this text.
Yeah, no, I think that's beautiful. I mean, I think it was John Donne who said, right? I one thing in mankind concerns me because I'm involved in mankind. Do not ask for whom the bell tolls. The bell tolls for thee, or whatever. I think you're right about that, and that is what the text is getting at in a lot of ways. Other questions, thoughts? Things you're going to be awake tonight, gosh, I wish I had said that thing. You're all sleep well. All right, well, so why don't we close it there, I guess. It's been an absolute pleasure learning with you all. Thank you so much for hanging in there with some heady stuff. This stuff is no joke, and thanks for hanging in there with me. I will hopefully have an opportunity to schmooze with many of you tomorrow. And until then, Darren, is there anything else you want to highlight for folks before we sign off?
No, I just want to say thank you, and thank you everybody for being here. And tomorrow morning, Rabbi Reznick's going to be leading a young family service first thing in the morning at 10 o'clock, and then a Q&A for mostly young families. And then we'll do a drush at 11. And then after the rabbi's drush, we've kind of consolidated a Q&A to kind of as a catch-all for any questions you might have for the rabbi on anything, whether it's the community, whether it's leadership, whether it's ritual, religion, service, whatever questions you have, that will be the time to ask them. And then in the afternoon, Rabbi Reznick will have the small group sessions with a smaller number of people, and hopefully you'll get a chance to get to know him a little bit more. So I just wanted to thank you, Rabbi Reznick, and thank everybody else. I know it's a little later for us than normal, but been very stimulating, and good night. Shavua Tov.
Thanks, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Shavua
Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Thank you. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.